This can be a scary topic. This topic is extremely sensitive in our country. Racism. Some feel that authentic racism is being overlooked. Others feel that the term racism is being applied too quickly. But on what does America agree? That racism is a bad word. In general, people do not wish to be viewed as racist. In such a sensitive context, one might conclude that the safest position to take on racism is one of silence. The best way not to be misunderstood is not to speak. But God does speak. While the word racism cannot be found in the scriptures, God gives us exactly what we need to sound his call in our country and in our world. The clarity and nuance of scripture is precisely the path for us to follow, to occupy a confident position that we can share, not a position to defend a piece of territory that is primarily political, but a position that is at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. In fact, this perspective is to shape every human relationship that exists. And considering this perspective also reveals that human inclination that has the power to undermine every human relationship that exists, including relationships involving race. Paul wrote these words to Titus. One of Crete's own prophets has said it. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true, therefore rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth. Cretans, always liars? Is that racism? Painting an entire population with a broad brush? One wonders what our modern society would do with that verse. One trembles at the possibility that some might conclude God is a racist. But doesn't this offer a perfect example of how nuance is so important to any discussion about the differences that exist among people groups? These words of a Cretan prophet had nothing to do with skin color. Epimenides, the poet who penned these words, said what he said because the people who happened all to live on the island of Crete believed the same thing about something. They claimed to have a tomb for Zeus. Well, Epimenides believed Zeus to be immortal. So, Cretans, you are liars. Was Epimenides a racist against Cretans? Epimenides was a Cretan. While using an ethnic term, the trait he was identifying was not an ethnic trait, but a moral one as he saw it. And while his words were a generalization, he makes very clear that there are exceptions, and he was one. And Paul makes clear there could be exceptions too. He had just told Titus to appoint Cretans to be elders of the church, ones who were not to be liars like this. They were to be blameless. While one could make Epimenides and Paul look racist, we remember our obligation to take words in the kindest possible way. They were not looking down on someone because of their skin color. They were noting a real moral failing which is properly and directly addressed when someone loves someone. The same kind of observation could be made about any people group that lives together. There could be a spiritual weakness that is commonplace among them. Oh, there could be exceptions to this weakness, but even those exceptions could acknowledge that the behavior or attitude which has infiltrated a particular family of people is important to address, and they'd be humbly eager to help their brothers address it. Said another way, it's not always inappropriate to recognize that larger people groups may have a distinctive spiritual weakness. Americans and materialism, a group of people in another part of the world, may struggle with spiritism and superstition. Such observations need not be inevitably racist. The problem arises when we view someone with concern or negativity because of a trait that has nothing to do with spiritual weakness. When we look at others, we naturally notice differences. Yes, there are differences which are more individual, like he likes reading and she likes math, but there are also differences much more visible and pervasive, which we can all see with our eyes and hear with our ears. While sociologists have identified different numbers of races, we can say with confidence that there is more than one. And within a race, there can be multiple additional subgroups. Where did all of these come from? The Tower of Babel? Well, not exactly. The Tower of Babel happens in Genesis 11. Genesis 10 makes clear, however, that these groups were subdivided based on family lines. Did one descend from Shem or Ham or Japheth? And when God's judgment of imposing languages occurred in Genesis 11, he did it very carefully. It wasn't a random, every fifth guy speaks this language and every fourth guy speaks this one. The languages ended up matching precisely with the previously determined family subgroups. So, if you were Javan's son Tarshish, Moses reports that you spread out into a territory according to your clan within your nation, each with its own language. So, when we think about race today, what we are observing is first a separation which naturally occurred because people were in different families. A separation that was enshrined and sharpened by the Babel judgment of God brought on as a response to human pride. Those differences of a major sort which exist within humanity, to a large extent, reflect a divine plan to help humans avoid thinking that they can compete with God, that they can build a tower that will reach the heavens. The fact that we can't all easily talk with each other is a divine act to prevent accomplishments that could lead us to feel we can challenge the will of the Almighty. Said another way, we can thank God that we are different. What we quickly discover, however, is that this good gift of God, given in the context of humanity's natural inclination to pride and rebellion, so quickly can be exploited in pursuit of humanity's pride and rebellion. One example of this is sadly connected to the brother and sister of the man who penned the very words of Genesis 10 and 11 history. Miriam and Aaron, jealous of the leadership position God had given Moses, found a convenient way to make him look bad. They talked against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Now, Moses' wife Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, a Midianite, and so there's a question of how she could be called a Cushite, though it seems possible that those who lived in the southern part of Egypt, modern Ethiopia, Cush, had family connections with the area of Midian. Now, some wonder whether Zipporah had died and this was a second wife, but whatever the explanation, her origin was a chance to demean. Now, there was a larger agenda. Miriam and Aaron wanted the respect and position that God had given to Moses, but they tried to climb their ladder by demeaning a woman whose only fault in their eyes was the physical appearance she was born with. Branch Rickey, the once president of the Brooklyn Dodgers, is known in baseball history as the man who brought the first African-American, Jackie Robinson, into the major leagues. In the early 1900s, before Branch Rickey was president of the Dodgers, he was a coach at Ohio Wesleyan University. His baseball team took a trip to a city in Indiana. When they got to the hotel, the team's only black ball player, Charles Thomas, was denied a room. Rickey asked the hotel clerk whether Thomas could sleep on a cot in his room, and the hotel clerk said yes. Later that evening, Rickey happened upon Charles Thomas. Thomas was sobbing and rubbing his hands. These words, black skin, if only I could make them white. My friends, this is a history that for many in our country feels more like a fresh memory. We might imagine how Moses felt when his brother and sister attacked him by attacking his wife. We know how God felt. God asked Miriam and Aaron to stand before him. God said, "Listen to my words. With Moses I speak face to face. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The anger of the Lord burned. The skin of Miriam became leprous like snow. Moses pleaded for her. The Lord insisted that she stay outside the camp for 7 days. Pride. And finding any way to bring someone else down to maintain one's pride is repulsive to our God. And yet it is so easy for all of us to operate with a mentality of pride. We hear a person struggling to speak our language, and we think first that they must not be very intelligent. We ride on a bus in the streets of Rome and watch cars not honor the lane markings, and are tempted to think our own culture inevitably superior because we stay in our lanes. We may meet a young black man and start from the presumption that he probably has a checkered past. Or as a black man, one might meet a young white man and assume that he's filled with hatred and intolerance. According to our sinful flesh, our instinct is to look down on others. We don't need race to make this possible. But it so happens that with any difference, and race is such an obvious one, we can see the chance to gain an edge. We see difference as opportunity to exalt myself. We see distinction as a path to prove I am better. We see unique characteristics of another separated subgroup as inevitably inferior to the traits of my own. God is not hesitant lovingly to identify distinctive spiritual problems that are common to a group because he's passionate about helping people. But when we draw conclusions about others based on differences that are not spiritual problems, this is arrogance. The Miriam-Aaron trap, building our own pride-filled Tower of Babel. We would rightly deserve the consequence, not of 7 days outside of the camp, but of days that never end, completely separated from God's love. Racism and every other example of human pride is powerful to transform, tragically, our future. 7 days. After 7 days, Miriam was allowed back into the camp. Though God wants there to be no doubt that human pride is pure evil, his gentle reacceptance of a woman reveals a heart that had a much bigger plan for the world. The God who separated peoples to set limits on pride himself bridged a gap not between black and white or olive and brown, but between God and man. He made himself nothing. And being found in appearance as a human, he lived and died for the separation that pride created between us and God. God came down hard. By his grace, we will never know how hard, because Jesus made our interests his own. Jesus made the interests of all peoples. A Syrophoenician woman, a Roman centurion, you, his own, that he might give you peace. Jesus died for the sin of racism. Jesus died for the sin of pride. Jesus died for you and for me, forgiven. And you know exactly what to do next. In our own country, this can feel like an impossible issue to address. But really, the path opposite racism is the path opposite all that is self-centered. Hear God's words. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. If God has brought you into this world through a family that is black, God asks you to look at those around you and consider them more valuable than yourself, to consider them above yourself, to consider them as someone that you are eager to think about, to care for, to sacrifice for. If God has brought you into this world through a family that is white, God asks you to look at those around you and consider them more valuable than yourself, to consider them above yourself, to consider them as someone that you are eager to think about, to care for, to sacrifice for. Now, at the heart of looking to the interests of others is understanding the experience of others. Now, it's true that we may never be able to understand fully what others have experienced. And yet, can we talk with them? In the course of that conversation, should a spiritual weakness be detected, you won't decide forever to overlook it for the sake of acceptance. You know that God, even when he looks at groups of people, is never hesitant to address authentic spiritual problems. But beyond that, you seek to understand so that you might know how you can help, be a friend, show godly acceptance and love. And you're not doing this with pity. You are looking at this other human as the king of the world. You're looking up to them. You are thinking, I feel honored to have this kind of a conversation with you. In such a moment, you will not deny the obvious. God's approach to racism is not to imagine that our goal is to erase the reality of differences. It's God himself who brought these differences into this world. Our goal is to recognize the differences, understand the differences, and in humility, make the interests of others my own. There is a single race, the race to be the first to embrace the interests of others.